Hello everybody, Jordan Nelson here. Today we're going to be talking about what exactly you should be considering when you're looking to buy a new camera for your wedding videography setup. Whether you're looking to buy a new one for an upgrade or this is your first wedding videography camera. We're just going to go through some things you should be looking out for when you're looking to make that purchase. Now, wedding videography comes with its own sets of challenges and environment. So there are certain things in a camera that you're going to want to look for that a camera would be particularly strong at, or something that you don't want a camera to be particularly weak at if you're going to be doing wedding videography. All right, now this list is in no particular order, so let's jump in here. Number one, low light. So when you're looking for a camera, you're going to want something that has pretty decent low light, because for wedding videography or even any event videography, you're not always 100% sure what you're walking into. What's the lighting going to be like when you get there? Now, you may have a setup where you have a bunch of lights that you're bringing into a reception. I'm not that person at this point, and I think a lot of people aren't. So if you're even getting started, it's probably a good idea to invest in a camera that has really good low lights. So you're not having to lug around lights with you, or to invest in those lights later on. But it's really helpful to have a camera that's able to handle it. So in a reception, the reception can be really, really dark, and if you're gonna have to pump up the ISO on a camera that doesn't do very well in low light, you're gonna have the noisiest footage ever. My Canon Rebel T6i, I bought that camera not really expecting to do wedding videography. And then when I got into it, man, I just saw the limitations of the camera. So low light is not something it thrives in. It's a very, very, very entry-level camera at this point, if I'm really wanting to grow. So low light's really important for wedding videography cameras because you really don't know what you're gonna be walking into. There are a lot of dark situations. Sometimes wedding venues, the actual ceremony itself is dark. Sometimes the reception is dark. And if your camera just can't handle it, you're not gonna get very good footage. Even if you do have a lighting setup, sometimes a lighting setup just doesn't work for the certain situation. With event videography and wedding videography, sometimes things happen that you're just not expecting, and you have to just get the shot as things are happening. You can't say, okay, 1, 2, 3, go. The day kind of happens, and you have to do whatever you can to capture it the best way that you can. So having a camera that can handle low light, in case you can't get another lighting source onto the subject, is going to be really, really helpful. Number two, frame rates. So my current camera now does 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. That's it. There's no 120 frames per second. But for the 24 and the 30 frames per second, it can do full HD 1080p. But for my 60 frames per second, all it goes up to is 720p, which at this point is just not very acceptable. We're getting to the time of 4K and for sure 1080p. So I know in post-production you can go and you can upscale that, but it's just not the most ideal situation. So you want to be able to get a camera where you can use slow motion if that is the type of video that you want to create. If that's the type of wedding film feel that you want, which is what I like to do, is to have a lot of slow motion, especially in the more artsy parts of the video. So if they're taking photos or things like that. So in the ceremony itself, I may do some slow motion, but I'm really just trying to capture the day the best I can at that point. But if you want something where there's 120 frames per second, if you really want that distinct feel for some of those shots, you're gonna wanna consider, it's like, is the 120 frames per second, is it gonna be in full HD? What are the capabilities there? So I would suggest what I want is full HD all the way up to 120 frames per second. Now, if you really don't care about doing slow motion in your videos, if you're strictly gonna do 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, it's probably not as big of a deal to you, but you really have to decide if you want that capability in that camera. All right, number three, autofocus. Now this is really important, especially for wedding videography, event videography, when things, you kind of have to run and gun a little bit in certain situations. There's a lot you can do with manual focus, like when you're doing your establishing shots, or doing photos, or just people that aren't doing a lot of moving. But if you have to track people, if there's a lot of movement, if there's stuff at the reception that you want to capture that you just have to use autofocus for, you want to make sure that your camera is not going to be searching a lot for the focus, going to the background and the foreground, just searching for what to focus on. You want a camera where you can lock onto a subject and stay on that subject pretty well. You don't want to rely on autofocus all the time for everything. Manual focus does have its place, but also a lot of people struggle when they're starting out to use manual focus, especially wondering, hey, do I actually have my focus on my little LCD screen there? So yeah, you do want a camera that does well in autofocus, especially for the wedding videography landscape when things are just happening around you. Now, number four, does your camera have accessible and quality lenses that you can build off of that camera and for all the cameras you're gonna have in the future. So when you're shopping for a camera body, I'd say go ahead and make a plan of attack for the lenses that you're going to purchase over time to invest in those and build your collection there. So you have a wide variety of different focal lengths and apertures. I think it's just gonna be really helpful as you're planning what your equipment repertoire is gonna be. All right, number 5. Are there 4K capabilities on the camera that you're wanting to purchase? Now for wedding videography and event videography, like at this point for me, that's not a 100% a priority for me to have a 4K camera, but for videos that I do want to use 4K for, maybe some other YouTube video I want to create, I want it to be future-proof. 4K takes up a lot of space when you're editing and when you have it on your hard drives. So doing a full day of event videography or wedding videography, I'm hard pressed to have enough storage to be able to handle all that. So I'm probably just gonna stick to full HD for a little bit here, but it does future-proof your camera because 4K is gonna start to become the standard over time here. So if you do want a 4K capability now for your wedding videography, I'd say go ahead because that'll future-proof it. It ties all back into the frame rates as well. Does 120 frames per second have 4K? Does 60 frames per second have 4K? 30, 24? Are there any crops involved with the 4K? So those are things to consider. How much do you value having 4K in your camera, and do you think you're gonna use it in your videography, in your wedding videography? All right, number 6, battery life. Wedding days are very long days, and you're gonna be doing a lot of shooting and using a lot of battery. So you're gonna wanna have a camera that has a decent amount of battery life so you're not having to run back and forth charging batteries, or if you're in the middle of a really important shoot that your camera's quickly losing battery and you're just thinking of when am I gonna be able to get to somewhere with an outlet where I can go and change it. And sometimes if you have it on a certain rig like a glide cam or something, you have to take the camera off the glide cam, switch it, put it back on, make sure it's balanced. It's just not ideal. So if you have a camera that has really, really good battery life, that's one less thing you're having to worry about consistently throughout the day. Number 7, is this camera gonna be weather sealed? Once again, you don't know what the weather's gonna be like. A lot of outdoor weddings, a lot of pictures outside, going outside to inside. You don't know what is gonna end up happening. It could be snowing, could be raining. You're gonna make sure that the camera that you're gonna purchase is able to withstand that, or you're gonna have to make provision for it some other way. Maybe you have, like the camera bag case thing that you put over it to protect it from the weather. In my opinion, I'd rather just go ahead and have a weather sealed camera so I'm not having to deal with, in crunch time, having to put this bag over it, make sure my camera doesn't get destroyed. All right, number 8, last but not least here, does your camera have dual SD card slots? Because in wedding videography, there are no do-overs. You can't say, hey, go ahead and get married again. I missed it. Everything got corrupted on my SD card. If you lost it, you lost it. Probably have to get a refund. The couple's gonna be very upset that they didn't have a video. So dual card slots is gonna give you so much peace of mind. If one card does fail, you can make a backup card so it is writing to 2 cards. All right, so that's it for the list of considerations. There's so much more we could talk about, not an exhaustive list at all. Those are just things that came to my mind when I was thinking about certain challenges that I've had here in my first year or so of doing wedding videography. So for myself, I just pre-ordered the Sony A7 III. I've had the Canon Rebel T6i for the past year doing weddings, but it is really time for an upgrade for a lot of these reasons because my camera's not very good at a lot of things on this list. But now it's time for an upgrade, made it to that point. All right, so I'm gonna go through here and kind of tell you how the Sony A7 III kind of fits into each one of these categories for the goals that I have for the camera that I want to be able to shoot really good wedding videography. Mind you, Sony is not paying me anything for saying any of this. I just think it's a really good camera, but Sony, I am available. I'm only like half joking. All right, so Lowlight. Just go ahead on YouTube and look up Lowlight comparison or something like that for the Sony A7 III. It does a phenomenal job. It is very usable up to 6400 and over 6400, even 12800. It's very usable. So I think the Lowlight capabilities on this camera are gonna be insane, especially compared to the camera that I've been using up to this point. It's just gonna blow it out of the water. But it even compares to the Sony A7S II, which is a low light video camera. It's made for that. It's comparable to it. Probably not as good in low light because it's not what it's strictly designed for, but it is very comparable. I think it competes really well with all the other features that they put on this camera. All right, so frame rate. The Sony A7 III can do all the way from 24 frames per second up to 120 frames per second, all at full HD 1080p. Really excited about that. Like 120 frames per second just always looks so cool to me and I can't wait to use it. All right, autofocus. I don't mean to just push you to other videos, but so many have already been done because this camera's been so hyped up. But watch some of their autofocus tracking videos. The autofocus is really, really good from what I can tell. I mean, I've only pre-ordered the camera. It comes out in a week and a half or so. And I don't know until I try it, but I've just seen examples out there, and I think it's really, really good, especially compared to my current camera, which is searching all the time for autofocus. And then some of the specs on the Sony A7 III are incredible as well. 693 focus points, covering 93% of the frame, and then 425 contrast autofocus points. So it can autofocus twice as fast in low light and track twice as fast compared to the A7 II, this camera's predecessor. So it is just a huge step up from the previous camera in this line here. And then the autofocus algorithm is based on the A9, and the A9 is over twice as expensive as this camera, and they really based it on this. People call this a mini A9, and I think that's an accurate title from what I see of all the specs and all the videos that I've watched and all the research I've done on it. So we're really excited about the autofocus capabilities on this camera. All right, so those accessible and quality lenses. The Sony lens landscape has astronomically increased in the past few years because Canon was the king of that before, and now Sigma has just announced a new line of lenses compatible with the Sony FE body. So I think Sony is not short any amount of lenses at this point. I think they're plenty enough, especially if you're just getting started. That's not something I'd worry about with the Sony line at this point. All right, so the Sony A7 III also has a 4K capability at both 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second. The 24 frames per second, it still is the full frame, but at the 30 frames per second, there's a 1.2 crop factor, which isn't terrible. So this is not like a full 4K camera where anything you want to do, you can shoot 4K. Slow motion is probably just not going to happen, but it can get your feet wet in it. It can future-proof your videos if you're going to be shooting in 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. The battery life on this camera is insane. So everything that I've seen, everything I've read, everything I've heard, just said this is the best battery life of any mirrorless camera on the market at this point. People saying they were out for hours testing and shooting this thing and didn't have to change their battery. I'm just really excited as a wedding videographer going through a wedding day and maybe one time having to change my my battery there, especially for a mirrorless camera. So I think that's a huge, huge upgrade. So some of the specs on that, it can record up to 710 images on one battery charge versus 650 on the A9. Again, the A9 is over twice as expensive, so it has an insane battery life. Obviously, the A9 has other features that this one doesn't, but the battery life, if that's important, which I say it is for a wedding videographer, then yes, this is a great camera for it. All right, next would be the weather sealing. It is weather sealed, thumbs up. And then last but not least here, dual card slots. This camera does have dual card slots. They fit so much onto this camera, it's insane. So some of the fun things about this camera that just make it a really good mirrorless camera are that it still has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. So the Sony A7S II has a 12.2 megapixel sensor. So it's probably not a good photography camera, but it is a really good low light video camera. So this one is really give you the best of both worlds. There's also a 5-axis in-body stabilization inside of this camera, so it is stabilized. Probably doesn't compare as much to the Canon cameras, which have really good stabilization, or maybe later Sony cameras, but it still does have that in-body stabilization, and it is better than previous cameras in this line. But I would say if you're a wedding videographer here, I would stabilize your footage with like a monopod or a gimbal or a glide cam or whatever. This is also a full frame camera, so it uses the whole sensor, but you can also push into an APS-C crop. So you can push in and get more focal length out of the lens that you're using. I think for me, if I'm gonna start to switch from Canon to Sony, I'm probably gonna have one lens. It's gonna be a little bit of a wider angle, so it's gonna be helpful for me to push in if needed. And then another thing too, you can customize your menu setup. So whatever way you want to get into your menus, the buttons that you want to push for certain things, you can customize that, which I think is a huge feature. It just makes things go really smooth once you kind of get the hang of where you want things to be. I think the kicker for this entire camera is that it is only $2,000. They packed a ton of stuff into a $2,000 mirrorless camera. I just can't really imagine any other camera that I would want to purchase right now because it doesn't compare to the price. I'm a wedding videographer on a budget. I'm not just throwing a ton of money around. Therefore, this has a ton of specs on this camera that are integral to being a wedding videographer, and it is considered an entry-level basic model with Sony, and it is much more than that. Just the hype about it's just so insane that I don't really probably need to explain that much to you. Probably just stop talking. So thanks guys, I hope that was helpful. Hope you guys kind of got a framework for what you're thinking about when you're about to buy either a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, wedding videographer or not. Hope that was at least a little bit helpful. I don't know, I'm just a guy. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.